Hello everyone, I'm English Grandmaster Garwin Jones, and welcome to this part 2 of my lifetime repertoire, The King's Indian Defence. Now in part 1, I covered White's perhaps critical tests of trying to refute the King's Indian, where he takes control of the centre with knight c3, e4, and here I covered White playing knight f3, castle, and bishop e2, the whole Mar del Plata complex, the Gligorich variations with bishop e3, the Petrosian, all the different variations here, as well as the Makhannikov things with h3 here instead of bishop e2, and we concluded it by looking at the same-ish with f3. In this part, we'll look at everything else that White can throw at us. I can roughly divide the content into two, where in part 1 we saw what is supposed to be White's critical tries at a refutation of the King's Indian. White takes all the space on offer, but gives us our counterplay and says, okay, I don't believe you. But I hope that after watching part 1, you will believe me and enjoy those positions. Most White players aren't really very happy to go into those complexes, and so they try earlier deviations, and we'll cover all of those here. We'll start. I should just say before I start going through in more depth that don't worry if you've not watched part 1 yet. You can start with part 2 and then move back to part 1 if you're interested by the lines covered here, or you may have some lines in the classical that you're happy with already, or you may even be a Grunfeld player and just frustrated by some of these sidelines and anti-Grunfeld move orders. All of that is covered here, and so you can happily start here and move back. There are a few things that are crossovers, but for those it doesn't matter which order you watch the two videos in. This course, part 2, will start by White's trendy approaches where he leaves his knight back on g1. For example, playing h3 here with the intention of playing bishop e3. The point is to control the g4 square so we don't have an annoying knight g4. Now these lines White will probably play g4 himself, and they're quite strategically complicated. White is trying to prevent us playing on the king side with f5, but in return he has to be extremely accurate because he's playing with his king stuck in the centre, and one misstep and his whole position collapses. Bishop e2, with the same idea, reaches very similar positions, and we can play in a similar way. I'll look at setups where White plays an early bishop g5. In general, when White plays bishop g5, I'll recommend switching to the c5 break and playing in Benoni or Benko spirit. For one thing, the bishop on g5 makes it harder to achieve e5. The pin from the bishop on g5 down to our queen is a bit awkward. So e5 is harder, but for another, c5 really gains in strength because the pawn on b2 is now much more vulnerable. If we play some Benko gambit style with b5 or simply queen b6, queen a5, White would much prefer that bishop out on g5, back on c1. Often we'll kick it back with h6 and bishop h4 as well, put it right on the side. We'll cover various other topical and not so topical sidelines that White can try against King's Indian. Things like the Saruhan variation with bishop d3, where White tries to keep control of the e4 and f5 squares, but loses control of d4. And I'll explain how we can exploit that. The odd things like the Hungarian attack with knight ge2, the Smyslov variation with knight f3 and bishop g5, and of course the 4 pawns attack. Something that sounds scary, but I'll indicate, and hopefully that you'll agree with me, that it's really much scarier for White than Black. It's very difficult for him to keep control of his pawn on e4 while combating our queenside counterplay. If he's not very careful, his whole position collapses. We're happy to sacrifice a pawn and sometimes even a piece to open up his position. The full theoretical might of the course is probably on the Fianchetto variation with g3. Now this has annoyed King's Indian players for years. Instead of trying to refute our setup, White is going for a symmetrical approach, copying us. He's trying to restrain our counterplay rather than getting any big advantage. And while I've tried a lot of different setups, I've often been caught between lines that equalise but are dull, or lines that are exciting but objectively bad. But I'm very happy with what I play at the moment, and I'll share that with you. And that's to play the setup with d6 and c5 against practically anything. We put pressure on the pawn on d4 and try and force him to play d5, when we're likely to transpose into Benoni structures when we play e6. However, we're going to annoy aficionados of the Averroet books, which these days seems to be practically everyone who plays the fianchetto, by playing a move order not discussed there that bypasses the most topical line against the fianchetto Benoni and keeps our opponents guessing and on their toes. Now, I'm sure if you've tried playing the King's Indian already, you'll know that a lot of players try to spoil our fun with early sidelines. And I cover all those in this course too. That from the London systems with bishop f4 or knight f3 and bishop f4. But I really don't think this is something that we should be worried about as King's Indian players. Our position retains a lot of dynamism, and we're still going to play for the e5 break. In fact, I think white needs to be extremely accurate, or he's just left in a strategically worse position, as we've got much more flexible position. In general, I'll be recommending a double fianchetto approach, followed by breaking with e5. We'll also look at some other topical sidelines, and well, all the sidelines, but including the topical ones. For example, things like the Yabava Verasov with bishop f4, when I'll still recommend going g6. I'm going to recommend fianchetting this bishop wherever we can. The Torre attack with knight f3 and bishop g5, the Trompovsky with an immediate 2 bishop g5, as well as looking at white's other first moves. Everything bar 1e4 will be covered in this part 2, including Adavan's 1b3, which really won't scare us in the slightest, 1c4, 1 knight f3, even dodgy things like 1g4. I mentioned in part 1 that one of my frustrations with the Benko Gambit, and the reason I switched to play the King's Indian, was that I could never actually play the Benko, all these move orders. One of the huge advantages of the King's Indian is its flexibility. We're able to play it against absolutely anything except 1e4. And so we'll get our setups and our type of game, regardless of what our opponent plays against us. I hope you enjoy the course. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you inside. Bye.